that itself is worth the money, I think, to be able to capture these presentations and share them. All right. Well, Ralph usually lives in Cincinnati, Ohio, and but he's currently speaking to us from Birmingham, Alabama. And Ralph has a blog called Facing Islam that you could go to on the internet, and you can subscribe to. I encourage everyone to subscribe. You can ask for daily or periodic emails that will that tells what his posts are. Always very enlightening. Sometimes he publishes to his blog gets published to other sites also. Trying to think how many years now, Ralph, have you been running your blog?
Let's see. Wow, we just passed the 7th anniversary. We're closing in on 900,000 page views.
And then actually, Jan herself has Ralph's book. So let's see if I can.
Great.
So for David, it's available. If anybody wants it, I have like 4 more copies I can sell to anybody who wants them. So I have that available. Anyway, so I'm going to let Ralph go ahead and take over and present his topic, the Shroud of Turin. And actually at the end, he's going to tell us a little bit about another project that he's working on. I'll let him do that at the end. Okay, take it away, Ralph.
Okay, thank you, John. Thank you, everybody, for being here. I'm still trying to kind of master my screen here, and I think what I need to do is exit full screen.
Yeah, exit. Just do.
Yeah, there we go. Okay, so I got rid of the side navigation bar, and so this presentation falls under the category of building up our faith, also having something really. I don't want to say fun because that's kind of a frivolous word, but I do think that this is a fascinating topic that all of you are familiar with at some level, I'm sure, of the Shroud of Turin. And is it the burial shroud of Christ? Is it authentic? It raises enormous questions. And so with that said, let me just plunge into this, my Apple Keynote presentation here, see if I can get it to work. This is going to be, I'm experimenting here, and that's, yeah, so we'll get into, okay, good. So it is going to let me do that. And yeah, so the Shroud, it's referred to in many different ways, relic. I've seen some writers refer to it as a witness of the resurrection and of the crucifixion, both. Definitely is considered a mystery. I think we can also speak of it as an icon, a very special icon, an image. Perhaps, and one of the words we'll come across for it in this presentation is the image not made by hands. And so that's why I very deliberately go from this of the shroud to this of the image not made by hands, also called the Holy Mandilion. And this clearly shows it on fabric, which is a very significant development in iconography. So what is the shroud? Some key attributes of it. It's an ancient, very ancient cloth. If you believe the carbon-14 dating, it dates back to the 13th century, but there's plenty of evidence to tie it to the 1st century. It's in interesting dimensions. It's 14 feet 3 inches by 3 feet 7. Well, as you'll see on the bullet points, if you parse that out, if you calculate that, that actually locks into a biblical measuring unit of 8 cubits by 2 cubits. I find that very fascinating. There are also enormous numbers of permanent creases and folds, burn marks. It's almost been destroyed on at least 3 separate occasions, a couple of times by arsonists. Most recently in the late 90s, there was an arson attack on it. So it's, and also water stains from putting out the fire. At various times, liquid molten metal has dropped onto it and caused burns. And we can see those. I guess my cursor disappeared, so I can't really point to them. But we can see some of those burn marks on here, and obviously on this image you can see the patches and repairs of it, and those burn marks around those 2 vertical folds. up and down, left and right of the image. Thanks be to God, providentially, the image itself has not been seriously damaged. There's a gap in the on the left side arm, which would be the right arm of the, well, no, it would be the left arm because this is a negative image. On the left, and there's a gap, large gap out of the arm on upper arm on the right. Also, you'll see there's a dark area on the right hand upper body, just below the pectoral muscles. That is the blood flow from the wound in the side that corresponds to Christ's wound when the soldier put the lance in his side. So there, fortunately, the most significant portions of the shroud were not damaged in all it's been through. It bears a faint double image of an adult male, both front and back, and we'll see that as we go through. And there are clearly wounds and blood stains, blood flows visible on the hands, arms, feet, head, the top of the head, the back of the head, the side, the back of the man's back, the back of his legs, also on his chest and the front of his legs in places. And so it's pretty comprehensive, the injuries that he suffered, and all of these are very clear and able to be seen. This is a full view of it. I'm not sure if your navigation window impedes any of that. Mine is hovering over the back of the feet on the right-hand side. And so I can't see the blood and the wounds on the feet, but it's very pronounced. And we can see what look like scourge marks, and we'll see later on how these correspond perfectly to ancient examples of Roman flagellums. So it's very, very interesting how these wounds and marks and bloodstains line up perfectly, if you will, with what we would expect to see if we had a, for lack of a better word, a forensic photograph of a victim of Roman crucifixion. Now, the history of the shroud is fascinating, and what I'm going to do is give the history of it basically centered around author Ian Wilson's image of Edessa theory. He's the most prominent historical writer on the shroud, and has been writing about it, studying it for over 40 years, really back from the mid-60s, really, I guess, 50 years since he became interested in it. He's in his 70s now. Just put out another a book recently, which reminds me, John, did you see my email I sent about half an hour before our meeting began?
No, unfortunately not.
Okay, no worries. In that email, there is an attachment to a PDF file I created. And if you, at some point this evening or at your convenience, share that with everybody, this is a bibliography and resource document I created with live links that you can click through in the PDF. It goes straight to these various documents, books, videos, everything. So I'm going to reference a lot of stuff in this, quite a few resources, and that attachment is my handout, if you will. That's my virtual handout, and that'll let you go back through a lot of these things and further explore it yourselves, and I think you'll really enjoy that.
So I do have that, and I'll good.
Okay, great, wonderful. And let me know if you find any bad links. I tried to revise it and update everything, but there might be some duds in there. So looking back at the first century, the shroud is mentioned in all the Gospels. Interestingly enough, and I tried to condense this so I wouldn't, turn it into like a monstrous presentation. In the synoptic Gospels, in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, the Greek word for the burial cloths is syndon, which means a burial shroud, singular. And that specific term is used in the Greek for the synoptic Gospels. However, John does something very different. John uses a word that indicates plural, burial cloths. And as we'll see later on, that has been interpreted at times in our iconography to mean that Christ was wrapped in strips or swaths, much like an Egyptian mummy. And you have probably seen icons of Christ or of the empty tomb with what looked like a mummified cloths left behind. So it's very interesting. We don't believe that's the case. We'll get to that much later on in the presentation. But in any case, the shroud is mentioned in the Gospels. It's also mentioned in the Proto-Evangelion of James, which is an Proto-Evangelion of James, which is an apocryphal, deuterocanonical, post-New Testament era text. That's the document from which we get much of our information about the Theotokos being taken to the temple at the age of 3. But it also indicates that, I believe it is John, presents to the servant of the high priest the burial cloth of Christ. So it's very interesting that that is specifically referenced in that. And again, that's the Proto-Evangelion of James. So according to Eusebius, the great church historian of the early church, he was writing in I believe the 4th century. The burial shroud, the cloth with Christ's image on it, is taken to Edessa, we believe, by the apostle Thaddeus during the reign of Abgar V, who died in 50 AD. And Abgar and the entire city converted to Christ. It does revert to paganism under Abgar's son, but at some later time, Abgar VIII, I believe in the 2nd century, converts back to Christianity. And from that point on, Edessa enters into kind of a golden era of being really under the protection of the shroud of Christ. Very interesting. From the second to the 6th century, there's very little mention of the cloth, but the text of, and I should say, I'm sorry, this image is an image of Abgar receiving the shroud from Thaddeus. And so it's clearly depicted as a horizontal cloth with the image of Christ's face on it. So that's what that image is. From the 2nd to the 6th centuries, there's no mention of the cloth really in any documents that come down to us. However, the tradition about Edessa is that Edessa is protected by a letter that Jesus wrote to Abgar. Abgar is alleged to have sent or supposed to have sent a servant asking for Jesus to come and heal him. Abgar was sick, some say leprosy, and Jesus is said to have sent a letter instead, that he could not come, that he was going to Jerusalem for his passion. And I'm really condensing and paraphrasing. So you may have heard variations on this, and I may be wandering from the proper wording, but that's the gist of it. So that tradition, Edessa first was thought and proclaimed themselves to have a letter from Jesus, not a cloth. Very interesting that is the tradition from those early centuries after Christ. Christian art of this era, Christian art of this era shows Jesus as a beardless Roman. And I should have grabbed an image of that. I didn't think about it till just now, but it's very interesting. He looks like just an ordinary Roman man in a toga, clean-shaven, short hair. Very, very interesting. Sometimes he's depicted with a lamb around his shoulders as the good shepherd. And so it's very interesting how he's depicted during this era. And I mentioned Edessa believing to be protected by the letter from Jesus. And then a very interesting thing happened in 525 AD. There was a massive flood, and much of the city was destroyed. And during the renovation, it is believed that is when the cloth itself with the image of Christ was discovered following the reconstruction after that flood. This iconographic painting depicts the discovery of the icon behind a panel over the entrance to the city of Edessa. That's what we're seeing here. So continuing with the history of the shroud from the 2nd to the 6th century, we're still in this long stretch of time here. In 544, Edessa attributes its deliverance from a Persian invasion by the Jesus imprinted cloth. No longer are they protected by the letter, but now they're protected by this cloth with Jesus's face imprinted on it. And it's referred to in some texts as the syndon, which is the word we have from the Synoptic Gospels. So that's very significant. It's also referred to by a very interesting word, tetradiplon in Greek, which means folded 4 times. And the image that we see on this slide shows how that folding might have occurred. We see the shroud on the left, vertical, both front and back, then folded in half in part 2. Then the second folding, the face is taking up the lower third, and then the back of the shroud is the top 2/3, and then the third doubling at the top right. The fourth doubling gives us just the face and the shoulders. And that is really the perspective that all the image not made by hands, which that's also when this term comes into play in the second half of the 6th century, the image not made by hands. And we see that from image number 6 on this larger image, a church image. That's where we get the Holy Mandelion, the image not made by hands. That's what's left when you fold the shroud tetradiplon 4 times. Very, very interesting, more than a coincidence. And of course, down at the lower right, that's Abgar again. I do want to show this very interesting mosaic. This was discovered just in the last 15 years in what used to be Edessa. It's now the Turkish city of Sanliurfa. Edessa, its churches were all almost completely destroyed during the Islamic occupation and during the iconoclastic period that, of course, they overlapped. This mosaic, though, was found in a house. It was not in any sort of official building or not in an old church. It was found in a house. It's not a very large size. It was kept in the museum there. And Ian Wilson, our hero and historical guide through all this, was alerted to this by a museum keeper. And so that's where we get that image. Very fascinating, because now no longer is Christ a short-haired, beardless Roman, but instead he has long hair down to his shoulders. He has large eyes and large eyebrows, and he has a beard. And these are features that we see on the shroud. And there's the Greek word, by the way, for not made by hands, the acheropoitia. So I'm probably butchering that. You Greek scholars can get me on that and correct that. So the history of the shroud, as we approach the turn of the 6th to the 7th century, as we approach the 600s, the church iconography begins to appear throughout the entire Christian world, showing Jesus as we now recognize him universally in Orthodox iconography. This is a side-by-side image, obviously, of the shroud on the right and the world-famous Pantocrator icon from St. Catherine's Monastery in the Sinai Peninsula. And we see the resemblance, and we also see the resemblance with the mosaic between these icons, these iconographic images, and the shroud. It's really pretty amazing. And in addition to this more than coincidental explosion of iconography based on the shroud, we think, there's also recently discovered manuscripts, and this is again just in the last 10 to 15 years, which indicate that monks from St. Catherine's Monastery took with them depictions of the likeness, as I'm going to start calling it, the likeness of Christ on the cloth. They took that with them to new churches in Georgia and elsewhere throughout the Christian world, so that the new iconography, which remember at the time was primarily frescoes painted right on the walls of the churches, that new iconography could match the likeness of the image not made by hands. This is a fascinating development in archaeology and in Christian history, to have this information available to us now of these manuscripts documenting this sort of missionary endeavor by the monks of St. Catherine's. The history of the shroud continues. Yeah, that's okay. So we're going back, looking at the shroud again. I guess that's another duplicate slide, and showing once again that similarity between the Pantocrator and the shroud image. Now, going on from the 6th century up through the middle of the 10th century, 944 specifically, more and more icons of a bearded Jesus with long hair spread throughout the Christian world. This likeness of Jesus is also used on coins throughout the Roman Empire, except, of course, during the iconoclastic period when icons were smashed, the coins were removed from circulation, and you know, the clean-shaven Jesus was restored, or there was no reference at all to him. But this coin, obviously from about 945, after the restoration of the holy icons, shows very clearly a resemblance to the image on the shroud and the nimbus around Christ's head with the cruciform, cruciform shape in the nimbus, in the halo. And through this all, the image not made by hands survives all these centuries of upheaval. Here is an image on the right depicting the transfer of the image not made by hands, the Holy Mandilion, to Constantinople, Emperor Romanos. He sent a large army in 943 to Edessa, which is now under Muslim control. This is you know, now 3 centuries after the death of Muhammad. So we want to keep that in mind as we go through this. Much of the Christian world has been already conquered by Islam. Constantinople has already been laid siege to twice by Islamic armies. Sicily has already been attacked. Rome has already been attacked and sacked once. Spain has fallen to Islam. This is an unbelievable time of dominance of Islam throughout what formerly was the Christian world for 6 centuries. So it's interesting that in this time period, the emperor of Byzantium, of Constantinople, the Eastern Roman Empire, Romanus, sends a large army to retrieve the Holy Mandilion. That's what he wants. That's all he goes for. And what does he do? He doesn't battle them for it. He barters for it. He barters for it. He offers the release of Muslim captives that were captured in battle, and he offers them payment. So he ransoms the image not made by hands, the Holy Mandilion, secures it, and brings it back to Constantinople. The general and all of his troops return, and this happens in 944 when they bring it back. August 16th is then established as the great feast of the Holy Mandilion, and it's transferred to Constantinople. That is what we are celebrating on August 16th when we sing, "We venerate thy most pure image, O good one, and ask forgiveness of our transgressions, O Christ our God," etc. But we venerate thy most pure image. This is the image we're venerating, is the Holy Mandilion, the image not made by hands. Very, very profound that this historical thread is very clear in the Orthodox Church. The history of the shroud continues. Images based on the likeness of the image not made by hands continue to spread now through Byzantium. Remember, it spread throughout Christendom over the previous 3 centuries. But now what we see within a century of its return to its transfer to Constantinople, we see the first icons depicting the likeness of Christ as a disembodied face on a cloth. And that's when we begin to have it referred to as the Holy Mandilion. And so we see this in virtually all icons from about this point of this feast, the August 16th, Christ the Savior, it's sometimes called, the Holy Mandilion, but it's always depicted as a cloth, usually held by angels, with Christ's face floating on it. Very, very interesting. Also around this time, Western pilgrims, visitors to Constantinople, report the Jesus imprinted cloth displaying, quote, "the form and size of the Lord's body to all who look upon it." Not just his face, the form and the size of the Lord's body to all who look upon it. That's a direct quote, and that's again, most of this is sourced from Ian Wilson. This is a phenomenal revelation to come across this kind of documentation. This is in the early mid-12th century. In 1192, the Hungarian Pray manuscript, it doesn't mean they prayed before, that's the name of the scholar who discovered it. And so the Pray manuscript shows it, and it's illuminated manuscript with all sorts of depictions of the events in the Gospels. Well, the Pray manuscript shows identical similarities to the image on the shroud. What are some of those similarities? And it's of the whole image. This is fascinating. First of all, the body is naked. You can maybe see it easier on this one. There's no loincloth around Christ's body. It's naked. He has no thumbs. I'm going to bounce back and forth. I hope you don't get dizzy. He has no thumbs. And as you'll see when we go back to images of the shroud, the man on the shroud, he has no thumbs. Why is that? Because when the nail pierces the wrist, it damages the nerve, causing the thumb to automatically press against the palm, and so it's an automatic reflex that happens. The Pray manuscript shows that, which indicates, really beyond a shadow of a doubt, that whoever drew that illuminated manuscript had seen the shroud or had seen a depiction of it. But most likely the shroud, because full-size depictions were not really common at that point yet. The bottom part of the Pray manuscript on the same page, this is, of course, an image of the empty tomb. We see the angel on the left and the myrrh-bearing women on the right. I'm going to bounce back up 2 slides so we can see the full width of it. Notice on the image of the shroud down at the bottom there, we see this kind of a stair-step pattern. That's the herringbone weave. That is showing the crisscross 3-to-1 herringbone weave of the shroud itself in that image. That's a phenomenal image to see. It also shows blood stains on it. This is really phenomenal stuff here. And it also, very, very importantly, shows a set of holes in an L-shaped pattern, which were caused by burn marks from an early Middle Age fire, probably around, well, before the Pray manuscript, which was 1192. So it had to have happened before that time. That's those little dots, those little circles in an L-shaped pattern, just under the forearm, the right arm of the myrrh bearer there. So you see those little circles there. Those are burn marks that exist on the shroud. And the artist included those in the Pray manuscript. That's an absolute indication that they were looking at the original shroud, the Shroud of Turin. There's no way around that. And we should keep in mind that all this documentation precedes the carbon-14 testing dates by at least 70 years. And so this is, upsetting their apple cart. The pagans will be upset with us on this. Okay. In 1203, so this is this is the year before the Fourth Crusade sacked Constantinople. This is a very providential communication we have. French Crusader Robert de Clary reports on, quote, the shroud in which our Lord had been wrapped. He's in Constantinople, and in 1203, he might have been part of a reconnaissance team, but he was certainly there on pilgrimage. He certainly went to the worship services, and he reports, quote, every Friday, this stood upright. The shroud in which our Lord had been wrapped stood upright so that one could see the figure of our Lord upon it. This is very, very profound. And of course, we tend to we in our modern age, we see the shroud stretched out horizontally, we see it vertically, we see it cropped, we see all sorts of versions of it. But it's interesting that while Constantinople became more and more under attack from Muslims and even from the Crusaders, they were bringing the shroud out to the faithful. And why would they bring it out on Friday? Why would he say this on every Friday? Well, because that's the day we commemorate the crucifixion, right? The Friday of every week we commemorate Christ's crucifixion, his passion, his death on the cross. So in the first, third, sixth, and ninth hours, there are special hymns every Friday in which we commemorate that. Now I've added this is great, I love this. I found a video clip from a movie that Ian Wilson helped to write and produce. This is one of 4 films by the British filmmaker David Rolfe, and this was done in 2010. And so just to show you an example of what this might have looked like, if it'll work for me. There we go. Whoops. Okay. Hang on. I had it and I panicked. All right, let's try it again here. And I turn the sound down. This is their kind of dramatization of what that raising of the cloth on Fridays might have looked like. And I think they nailed it. I think they absolutely nailed it. This would be accompanied probably to "Before thy cross, we bow down and worship, O Master, and thy holy resurrection we glorify." And there we see it. Of course, this is not the real shroud, but and it's dramatizing. It's making the wounds over red. So we see the blood stains on the forehead, the wound in the side, the blood stains on the arms and the wrist, etc. Pretty profound, very convincingly done. I was very impressed with that. I think I'm the first person to share this in a PowerPoint presentation. So, okay. Going on from there, 1204, Constantinople is sacked during the Fourth Crusade. Robert de Clary writes again, quote, "Neither Greek nor Frenchman knew what became of this shroud when the city was taken." Very interesting. However, in a letter of 1205, just a year after the sack of Constantinople, someone writing to Pope Innocent III, this is the Pope that blessed Francis of Assisi, so that gives us an idea in the West what's going on. This is the very beginning of the Franciscan movement. Letter to Pope Innocent III refers to, quote, "the linen in which our Lord Jesus Christ was wrapped after his death." And because of this letter, it apparently was connected somehow to Athens. If I understand it correctly, the author sent the letter from Athens. We think, or Ian Wilson thinks, that the shroud at this point had been safely gotten out of Constantinople and was in Athens. Less than a century later, about 80 years later, is the first reference of the shroud being in the possession of the Knights Templar in southern France. This is very interesting, 1287. So what do we find out then? Well, really, there's kind of a gap. There's not a lot known except that whoops, go back one here. The Knights Templar were kind of a very secretive group, and eventually a couple of them were burned at the stake for worshiping some sort of a disembodied head. That's very interesting and telling. No doubt the reports on what they were venerating were garbled a little bit, so that the authorities, and the religious authorities in particular, thought that they were worshiping an actual disembodied head, when in fact it was probably the tetradiplon folded image of the shroud in a form where they would only see the face. And this was like the final stage of their initiation, if you will, to the inner secrets of the Knights Templar order. So 1287 is the first reference to them having that image of the head in southern France. In 1355, so this is less than a century after that, about 70 years after the first hint of the shroud being in the possession of the Knights Templar, is the first known public exhibition of the shroud as we know it today, 1355. And that is about 35 years before the end date of the carbon-14 testing, which they gave a range of 1260 to 1390, I believe it was. But this was in Lirey, France, a church in Lirey, founded by Geoffrey de Charny, who was the first known European owner of the shroud. We trace him back a couple of generations, and it was, I think, his grandfather who was burned at the stake as a Knights Templar for worshiping the head. So this is all very fascinating stuff. A little bit vague, because there's, after the Crusade, the Fourth Crusade, there's definitely a tumultuous period of moving the shroud around, we think. From 1356 to 1464, so another century, the shroud remains with Geoffrey de Charny's line in Lirey. At the end of the 15th century, his granddaughter, who is childless, barters away the shroud to the Duke of Savoy in northern Italy in exchange for land and a castle, so that she has and her extended family have property and rights. In about a decade after that, the Duke of Savoy agrees to pay a rent to the Lirey clergy for their loss of the shroud, further connecting the shroud to Lirey, to Geoffrey de Charny, and then back to the Knights Templar. The Savoy family owns the shroud for the next 500 years, at various times. They actually are the royal house of Italy. Now the shroud is moved to Chambray, France, becomes widely venerated by kings, cardinals, and even popes. In 1532 is the most famous and potentially most damaging fire, and that's where we get the big burn marks, which were patched and which we can see on the image of the shroud. And you know, they patched it. The Poor Clare nuns. The Poor Clares are the female order of Franciscans. Just so you know, if you didn't know that, that's named after Clare, Saint Clare in the Roman Catholic tradition, who was a contemporary of Francis, and so they repaired the shroud after that fire. And it wasn't burned, but that was molten metal from the case it was in that dropped onto the fabric, which was folded. So therefore, it looks like if you folded a piece of paper up and snipped it away at certain points. That's why you would get that pattern. The shroud is then moved to Turin after decades of danger. Believe it or not, even the Muslims got that far north to attack, or that far east or west, I'm sorry, actually coming across the Balkans. So there was quite a bit of danger and constant movement. But finally, in the late 16th century, the shroud is settled in Turin, and 40,000 view it in the piazza on October 12th. This is actually a drawing from a century later, or really 2 centuries later. This is from the 18th century, but it shows the kind of the scene that you would expect. Just a massive, massive turnout of people, the shroud being suspended horizontally and held all along the top by the bishops and the uppermost clergy, probably some cardinals in there. Really fascinating. And you just kind of scan around that. You can see, obviously, the shroud with the front and back images depicted by the artist there. Really fascinating to imagine that being displayed in this manner in Turin for centuries like this. Every time there was a big event, it was even brought out for weddings of the Savoy family. Really fascinating. So moving on from there, and I'm going to compress history a little bit here. Otherwise, we'll be here all night. It's fascinating stuff. Numerous displays for various events, including to popes and royalty. One of the popes actually stopped in Turin to venerate the shroud on his way to crown Napoleon. This is amazing stuff. And of course, as I mentioned, for the Savoy weddings. This went on for 3 centuries like this, for over 3 centuries. Finally, now photography, I'm a photographer, some of you know that. Photography was invented in the early 19th century. And so not quite a century later, about 80 years after the invention of the photographic process, the first photographs were made of the shroud by an advanced amateur, Segundo Pia. In that age, people didn't have cameras generally. That was probably still at the age when almost everything was done with large, heavy view cameras. That would be 30 years after I think his name was Brodie, photographed the Civil War with a big view camera. This would be before the first Kodak box cameras. They, I think, came about a decade or 2 later. Well, Segundo Pia, when he developed the first image, and this reproduction on the right, I think, is from one of his images. He was so startled he almost dropped the glass plate after he developed it, because what he discovered was that the shroud image, which is so faint in normal viewing, in a photographic rendering, it reverses the tones and it gives much more depth, detail, information, and the image of a man is much more vivid, and the impact of it is just phenomenal. He was stunned by this, and it really spread for its day like wildfire. It was just amazing. He caught a lot of criticism for it. He was scandalized as putting on a hoax, as faking it. Interestingly enough, less than 5 years after the first photograph, the first forensic analysis was made in Paris by a renowned French anatomy professor, Yves Delage. He was one of the heads, one of the topmost people in the French educational university system of the day. He was one of the most revered people. He was an agnostic, and he analyzed the shroud. He analyzed the wounds, everything about it, and his conclusion was that it definitely showed the image of a crucified man, that it absolutely showed the image of Christ. And he caught a lot of flack. He was very severely castigated for that. And he said a very interesting thing. He said, if we had had a historical artifact of this nature from Plato, Socrates, Alexander the Great, any other historical figure of millennia ago, everybody would have said, wow, that's, I mean, of course, I'm putting this in modern slang here. He would have said, that's fascinating. What an amazing thing to have. But because it's Jesus Christ, I'm getting criticized because I'm drawing the only conclusion available from the information we have at our disposal. It's a fascinating rebuttal by an agnostic of the naysayers and secularists of his day. So kudos to Yves Delage for standing up for following where the facts led him. The history of the Shroud, things were kind of quiet for the next few decades. In 1939, a new series of photographs were made with much better quality, which confirmed Segundo Pia's results of 1898. In 1969 through 73, the first color photographs were made. In 1978, we have the famous STIRP scientific investigation. STIRP is the acronym for the Shroud of Turin Research Project. It was made up of a large number of acknowledged scientific professionals from the United States, and it was an international group as well. There were some ad hoc Italian scientists who joined the investigation. They had 5 days of unfettered access to the Shroud in Turin under somewhat challenging conditions. They had power struggles with getting uninterrupted power supplies, but they did an outstanding job of taking samples of pollen, non-destructive as much as they could, samples of the linen, analyzing the image, doing close-up photography, chemical analysis, on and on and on. And the image at the right is a depiction of another event that happened in 1978, the first use of a NASA device, which was used to study topographic detail on the moon and Mars, so that the NASA could plan where to put its landers on Mars, actually. And this VP8 image analyzer analyzes distance information. And amazingly enough, the same Shroud of Turin, which less than a century before was determined to have photographic properties and was a photographic negative for all intents and purposes. It's not a photograph, but it has those properties. It was also found to have embedded in the image distance detail, which enabled the VP8 to give actual 3D rendering of the image of the man on the shroud. So we see the facial features here, we see the torso, we see the arms and hands. Fascinating development. Of course, the burn marks and the folds are rendered alarmingly out of proportion. Just ignore those. But the image of the man, the image of the face is definitely clearly there. Very interesting. Very important thing to consider in the history of the shroud is the pollen samples and the analysis by Max Fry, an internationally recognized expert who was able to prove by documenting all of the different pollens that he found on the shroud that it had been in Jerusalem, that it had been in Syria, that it had been in Turkey, all the places we would expect, as well as France and Italy, of course. So he tracked it. He tracked it from Jerusalem up through the Middle East, through Syria, and what is modern-day Edessa in Turkey, so that's in eastern Turkey, then on to Constantinople. It's fascinating that he was able to prove all that. I don't have it on this slide. I don't think I have it listed later on. except possibly in a text segment. But in addition to the pollen samples, samples of the residue on the knees, and I believe even on the nose, reveal soil and dirt from Jerusalem of a very, very rare limestone that's found only in Jerusalem and only in the area where the tombs were outside of the entrance to the city where the crucifixion would have taken place. That's a fascinating development that, you know, a forger would never have been able to guess. I mean, I suppose you could imagine somebody traveling through the Middle East and picking up pollen everywhere they went. But really, the idea of limestone, a rare limestone. One other sample of pollen that was later found to be, or a sample of a flower that was later found to be on the shroud, was from a plant that's found only in Jerusalem. It only blooms during the spring, during the 14th month, or during the month of April in Jerusalem, and it only blooms in the afternoon. This was a knockout punch. I'm ad-libbing now, so it's not on the slide here, but it's fascinating that this flower was found, and you know, spores of this pollen from this flower that would have had it blossoming only at the time when the burial shroud would have been used to wrap Christ's body. Very, very interesting. Here's a graphic showing the 2,000 years of the shroud, all the big highlights that I've taken forever to go through. And so, you know, you can kind of glance at those and see that. But what's interesting also at the bottom, you'll see a timeline for the Sudarium of Oviedo. The Sudarium, the word Sudarium, can be translated as face cloth. And we believe that the Sudarium, Ian Wilson and other scholars believe that the Sudarium is the cloth that John, the evangelist, references when he indicates that they went into the tomb, they saw the burial cloths lying there, and the napkin which had covered his face folded up and lying in a separate place. The Sudarium would have covered Christ's face when he was still on the cross. I probably should put some images of it in here, but the interesting thing about it is it does not have an image, it has blood on it, and the pattern of the blood matches the pattern of the blood stains on the face portion of the shroud. So the Sudarium has actually had a more stable history. It's been in Spain from 644 to the present, and it can be traced very, very clearly back to 644 and pretty much back to the 1st century from that. So the correspondence of the bloodstains on the Sudarium with the bloodstains on the shroud is a further link, further helping to verify that the shroud does date back to the 1st century and cover the same man. Forensic studies show the wounds of the man on the shroud match those of a crucified man. And this is pretty clear here. Wounds to the forehead from the crown of thorns. We see wounds from flagellation. This is the front only, but it's much more clear with the flagellation or the scourging on the back. The wound in the wrist. And it's very interesting to note that iconography typically shows the nail through the palm, but if a man were nailed to across the palm, the nail would just rip right through. It wouldn't be able to support the weight. Whereas because of the juncture of the bones in the wrist, whether it was tied or not, in addition, a nail through the wrist would have been able to support. There actually was a forensic pathologist in the 1930s who tested that with cadavers. So I don't know if you could get away with doing that today, but he did it back in the 30s and verified that. Fascinating. We also see the wounds in the feet, the blood flow on the arms. The blood flow, if you look closely, you'll see that there's actually a couple of different tracks of blood. That's because the image of the crucified man changed. The angle of the arms changed as he raised himself up, and then he had to let himself down to breathe. So the angle of his arms varied from high over his head to down a little bit, and that's why there are two different blood flows on the arms. So forensically, the blood flows, all of that, really match up well. Of course, not to miss the wound in the side, and that puddles across the back image of the shroud. which is what we would expect if the shroud wrapped the whole body of Christ when he was taken down from the cross. Let's see, kind of duplication there. Here we are. This shows a black and white version of the front and back. On the back, we can clearly see the scourge marks, and matching that kind of double kind of flagellum design there. They line up perfectly, and it's really shocking to see those. There are over 100 wounds. It's interesting. Paul mentions in his letters that he thrice, I think, is it thrice or twice, received the 40 lashes minus one. Well, Christ wasn't lashed by the Jews. Christ was lashed by the Romans, and they didn't have a limit. And so it was about 100 times that he was scourged, that he was lashed. By the angles of the wounds, we can tell that the man on the shroud was lashed by two different men, two different people from different angles, one from the right, one from the left, and it's been analyzed very, very thoroughly. So it was quite excruciating trauma. The STIRP team, the Shroud Turin Research Project team, were still in 1978, determined the following, and I'm hitting the highlights here. There's no pigment whatsoever on the shroud. The image is not a painting. The image is extremely superficial. It covers only the top microns. We're talking an infinitesimal fraction of an inch thinner than a human hair on the topmost fibrils, microfibrils of the flax that makes up the shroud itself. It's such a superficial image that if you took a Gillette razor blade and raked it across the shroud, you would remove the image. That's all it would take. Just wipe a razor blade across the material, and the image would be gone. The molecules would be wiped away. There's no evidence of any spices, oils, or any biochemicals known to be produced by the body in life or in death that could have made the image. In other words, also it's important to emphasize, I think, that the image was not created by a decomposing body, that no biochemicals were exuded, nothing like that. Instead, it's an oxidation, and we'll learn a little bit. The latest studies, I'm not going to jump ahead too much, but there's some exciting stuff coming up here for us. These are images on the right of that 1978 study. The blood on the shroud is actual human blood. I believe it's type AB. What happens to blood when it dries on a cloth? If you cut yourself or something, it turns dark. Very dark or brown after a certain period of time, unless, and this is very interesting, in the case of where severe trauma has been experienced by the person bleeding, that causes a breakdown of the red blood cells, and it causes massive amounts of bilirubin to be released in the bloodstream by the liver. And that is why the blood on the shroud retains, to this day, this reddish color. It actually is noticeably red. That's due to the breakdown of the red blood cells and the bilirubin released into the bloodstream. And that would be what we would expect if someone was scourged that severely with over 100 lash marks like that. There's also a separation of the red blood cells from the serum albumin, which is visible in the post-mortem wounds, especially the one from the side, which puddled along the back. So we can see the separation of the quasi-clear serum from the red blood cells. Really phenomenal, very noticeable detail to the shroud itself, and the fact that there are both pre- and post-mortem blood stains on the shroud is very, very important as well. It means that the shroud covered, that the blood flows began when the man was alive, but the blood continued to flow even after his death. It didn't flow, but it puddled, or it oozed out as the body was transported, moved, laid down, finally, we would think, in the tomb. So the STIRP team determined the following. The scientific consensus is that the image was produced by something which resulted in oxidation, dehydration, and conjugation of the polysaccharide structure of the microfibrils of the linen itself. Such changes can be duplicated in the laboratory by certain chemical and physical properties. A similar type of change in linen can be obtained by sulfuric acid or heat. However, there are no chemical or physical methods known which can account for the totality of the image, nor can any combination of physical, chemical, biological, or medical circumstances explain the image adequately. Then they go on to say, the answer to the question of how the image was produced or what produced the image remains now, as it has in the past, a mystery. And then they conclude that for now, the shroud image is that of a real human form of a scourged, crucified man. It is not the product of an artist. The bloodstains are composed of hemoglobin and also give a positive test for serum albumin. The image is an ongoing mystery, and until further chemical studies are made, perhaps by this group of scientists or perhaps by some scientists in the future, the problem remains unsolved. So that's a group of scientists, virtually all of whom went in skeptical, at least two of whom continue to study the shroud to this day. Barry Schwartz, the documentary photographer on the group, and Dr. John Jackson, both of whom maintain extensive websites documenting the shroud. I have links to those in the digital handout that John is sending to you. But, you know, after that 1978 event, then 1988 pops up, and carbon-14 had been, you know, really getting a lot of attention in the press. And finally, a carbon-14 test was run on the shroud. Now, it's interesting. It showed the date range for it to be 1260 to 1390. And immediately, the headlines everywhere said, Turin shroud shown to be a fake. However, that flies completely in the face, even then, of all the historical data and much of the data collected by the STIRP team in 1978. One of the big things about the carbon-14 test is that they did not follow a carefully recommended and analyzed protocol for taking the samples from the shroud. This had been developed over the course of at least a year to try to give an accurate test of the shroud with the carbon-14 dating. They actually wound up taking all three samples from a piece of cloth about this big, about 2 or 3 inches in one specific area. It was supposed to be 3 or 4 samples from 4 different places on the shroud. They did not do that. They sent samples of the same location to 3 different labs. That's what they did. So that's a problem right there. They didn't follow the protocol properly. Also, the area that they chose was on the edge. It was an edge that we know from the drawings and even from documentation or eyewitness testimony of the shroud presentations from the 14th through the 19th century. That was an area that was held by clergy and laity to show the shroud during those presentations, during those exhibitions to the public. So it was an area that would have had an enormous amount of human DNA on it, soiled, gritty hands. We know that middle-aged people you know, didn't wash their hands a lot. They didn't know about germs. Black Death was, you know, a horrible time then. So extensive contamination. The area also may have been repaired, and there may have been cotton woven into the shroud to repair it because of all that additional handling and all. So there's real problems with it. I'm going to skip over a lot of this. There's a ton of material here. All of this is included in the extensive documentation here, but I do want to hit a couple of highlights. This topmost bullet point mentions the dust found in the vicinity of Jerusalem, found on the feet, knees, and nose. That's what I was referring to earlier. That's a very unique trace element, a unique type of soil that's able to pinpoint it in Jerusalem. Also, the weave and style of the materials were definitely from the Dead Sea area and could only have been woven in the period of Christ's life. So that's very, very important. It certainly it fits historically with what it is in the area and era that we would expect. both geographically and historically. And then Ray Rogers, a chemist, very very well known in the Shroudy community. He did some peer review research and determined that the patch that they used had been a rewoven area. That's been contested by some people, but it's interesting that he spent a great deal of time on that, and so that is still something that's being discussed and debated and looked at. This is the kind of the biggest news in recent times. This, and I guess I didn't put the date in here. This actually dates back to 2013, I believe, when this testing by the Italian National Agency for New Technologies, or ENEA, they determined that the penetration of the image's color into the fabric is extremely thin, less than 0.7 micrometers, 1/30th the diameter of an individual fiber in a single 200 fiber thread. The ultraviolet light necessary to reproduce the image of on the shroud of the crucified man, quote, exceeds the maximum power released by all ultraviolet light sources available today. The time for such a burst would be shorter than 1/40 of a second to have the detail that we see in the shroud. So it would be a split-second burst, and the intensity of the ultraviolet light would have to be around several billion watts. Really incredible deductions there by a team of scientists after 5 years of study of the shroud, and actually trying to replicate how the image was made on linen fabrics in their laboratories. They were able to approach that, able to begin to create something like that discoloration using lasers on very small areas of cloth, but there's no way they could do it on anything this large, and no way they could do it forming the image of a human body. Very, very interesting. All this to say that the image on the shroud may very well be the result of the moment of the resurrection. This is a clip from that same video of David Rolfe and Ian Wilson, and it doesn't show any great burst of light, but I kind of like the depiction of it. And of course, that separate cloth to the right of the shroud is the sudarium. That's supposed to be the face cloth that covered Jesus's face on the cross, and that was included in the tomb. So this brings us really, I think, to the first part of the conclusion here: faith in the shroud. You know, I've seen this this depiction in a number of places. This is a famous painting. I forget the author. It might have been Caravaggio, showing Thomas probing Christ's side. Nowadays, this is being used by Shroudies to indicate those of us wondering, is this the image of Christ? Is this the image of Christ's resurrection? Showing Thomas probing the wound on the side of the cloth. It's a fascinating thought. I love what my friend Brian Farrison. Brian has been studying the shroud for 30 or 40 years. He's a friend of mine at my parish in Cincinnati, Christ the Savior, Holy Spirit. He's done a presentation on the shroud as well as a PowerPoint presentation. I've been studying the shroud informally for about 10 years. Brian has a few decades on me, but I love this quote of his. He says, "For the skeptic, no amount of proof is sufficient. For the believer, no amount of proof is necessary." We don't rest our faith on the shroud. And I think that's one of the things I want to get across here is our faith comes from Christ himself, the witness of the apostles, the transformation of the apostles, their testimony of the empty tomb, the testimony of the myrrh-bearing women, the testimony in the Gospels, and the testimony of transformed lives, the lives of saints all throughout the ages, even down to our very own day. We can look at St. Paisius of Mount Athos, recent saints, ancient saints, all the same testimony, all the same faith, all the same witness of the resurrection. And we are called to live that resurrected life ourselves. I do want to skim through some iconography. This is a very rare one. I'd never seen this before. I encountered this a few years ago, showing John and Peter encountering the burial cloths in the tomb. I love that. I think that's a great iconographic depiction of them, not the myrrh-bearing women finally making it to the tomb after they were told that the tomb was empty, and that's what they encountered. This, of course, very famous epitaphios, the taking down from the cross. And notice that Christ is being laid on a cloth. The tomb is being prepared. That's Joseph of Arimathea on the right, wrapping the cloth around Christ's feet and preparing to wrap the cloth around him. Of course, all of our parishes, all Orthodox parishes, have an epitaphios, which shows Christ on the cloth. This is the epitaphios at one of the monasteries I visited for my photography project, photographing 36 monasteries in the USA and Canada. This one really nails it, and I love what they've done. Of course, most epitaphia will have the verses from the noble Joseph. The noble Joseph, when he had taken down thy most pure body from the tree, wrapped it in fine linen, and anointed it with spices, and placed it in a new tomb. Well, they have this also, but the depiction shows really the body almost perfectly in the pose that we see on the shroud, and the fabric they use looks like the shroud. So they really did an exceptional job preparing this epitaphios, and that's very vibrant when we look at the shroud and compare it to this. In Western art, there's quite a bit of depiction of the shroud, as we would expect, much of this dating from the 14th century and later. This one shows the angels holding the shroud in heaven as Christ is being taken down from the cross and wrapped in the actual shroud. So this is really kind of the ultimate Western depiction, Latin depiction of the burial shroud, and how that, I take this to be a depiction of God's providence in foreseeing that this image needed to be preserved and handed down to us in our day. This is the Holy Mandilion of Novgorod. This is, I think, dating from the 13th century. If I'm not mistaken, I might be mistaken on that. This is a recent Western depiction of the image not made by hands, showing it very clearly on a cloth, obviously made to patterned after the shroud image. We can see that tradition of using the shroud as the archetype for iconography continues to this day. Of course, we're very familiar with the myrrh-bearing women. We can see in this icon what looks like the mummified version of the burial cloths, and that is traditionally how that's how there's a strong iconographic tradition of the burial cloths being depicted that way. However, and I like this one too. This one shows the extensive wrapping of the shroud. This is, of course, the myrrh-bearing women and Mary Magdalene seeing the risen Christ. And so it's compressing the gospel accounts into a number of scenes in the single icon, which is, of course, typically, that's a technique that's done in much of our iconography. So using this icon of the myrrh-bearing women encountering the wrapped, the burial cloths, I like looking at this image from, again, from that same video of that same production by David Rolfe. And that's linked to, again, that's included. There's a link to how you can purchase that on the resource, the bibliography handout. This shows them having wrapped a mannequin or a depiction of the body in a replica of the shroud, and wrapping it with a strip actually cut from the edge of the shroud. I didn't want to get into this because it brings up another whole 10 minutes of discussion of how a narrow, about 3-inch wide strip that runs the full length of the shroud was apparently cut from the shroud and used to wrap around the feet, around the body to keep the knees together and the arms in place, all the way around the head, around the neck, and then tied at the feet and the neck to keep the body in place when it was laid in the tomb. And then after the resurrection, that strip was apparently reattached to the shroud. Very, very interesting. That's something that can be, you can actually see that in that video. It's called The Shroud of Turin, Material Evidence is the name of it. And again, that is listed on the handout. Now, this is an icon we should all be familiar with. This is the extreme humility icon It's a very weird icon because it shows the crucified Christ no longer on the cross. He's dead. Some of them show the blood pooling in his body, so the blood is mottling in his beneath the skin. His eyes are closed. His hands are crossed as they are in the shroud. Now we don't see the wound in the wrist, but we see Christ dead. But he's being raised up out of a box. And what does that remind us of? Well, that reminds us of that video clip that we saw earlier. Reminds us of that first-person documentary witnessing of Robert de Clary in 1203. That on Fridays they raise up the shroud with the Lord's body depicted on it. So that's where that extreme humility icon comes from. It dates to that period of late Byzantium, and that's where it began to be created. And Ian Wilson believes that the extreme humility icon came into existence after the sack of Constantinople in 1204 and the loss of the shroud, which was taken to Western Europe, we think. The extreme humility icon was an iconographic depiction of what once had been in possession in Constantinople. It's a consolation as well as a spiritual iconographic depiction of Christ, of an event that used to take place in Constantinople. It's a very profound icon. When we view it that way, we'll never be able to unsee this, as they say. When we see the extreme humility icon, we might be looking at a depiction of the burial shroud of Christ being raised up for the faithful to venerate in Constantinople, as it was done for probably a period of a couple of centuries after its transfer there in the 10th century. There have been adaptations of that icon, including the Theotokos embracing the dead Christ in the box. This is, to me, this is an example of a pious depiction of the Mother of God lamenting over her son, and that's great. But it's not really the depiction of the extreme humility icon as it was historically intended to be depicted. It's not bad. It's not wrong. It's beautiful. It should provoke tears and weeping and deep faith and compunction in us. But it's an adaptation of the extreme humility icon. Also, very, very briefly, and then we can open it up for some discussion if anyone wants to. If you don't need to get home and put the cat out. In the fourth week of Lent, there's lots. Believe me, this is Brian Ferrison, my good friend, has been compiling liturgical references to the shroud. This is from the fourth week of Lent, the week of the cross, in tone 8 of Lord I Call during Vespers. Today as we pass the middle of Lent, by the might of the cross, let us glorify the mighty God and Savior who was lifted up in the midst of the earth. As we look, show us your sufferings, Master, and your precious resurrection, granting us purification and great mercy. And so what Brian is saying here is that how can we see his sufferings and his resurrection? Is this, and are these liturgium, are these references to the shroud? Were the Byzantine Christians of the 10th through the 13th century, early 13th century, witnesses of the shroud, and did they liturgize, did they create some of the liturgical texts based on witnessing the cloth, the image of Christ on the cloth being raised up before them? It's a fascinating, provocative theory. He and I are going to be exploring that and trying to determine when the great hymnographers wrote many of these hymns and see if we can, cross-reference those with the time that the shroud was in Constantinople, or even when it was in Edessa. John of Damascus may have been familiar with it. There's quite a bit that needs to be researched there. So I thought that was fascinating. And then lastly, for our considerations as Orthodox Christians united in concern, it has always seemed to me, from the time I started researching Islam in 2008, seriously, writing my book, blogging since 2011, that Islam's whole purpose is to try to refute Christianity and it can't. and the proof that Islam is trying to refute Christianity really comes down to all the different verses that refute and try to reject the divinity of Christ and even the crucifixion. Allah, who's supposed to be God, who's supposed to be all-knowing, says they never killed him, they never crucified him. Well, obviously Allah is wrong, and obviously, that this is all just kind of bizarre pseudo polemics by the enemy of mankind trying to stir up a rejection of Christianity, and that is how I perceive Islam. Islam is a ruse of the devil. It has spiritual power behind it, but it's dark power, and it is, its only purpose is to try to cause doubt and try to overthrow Christianity, or to cause fear, or to cause us even to become somehow bent or warped or distorted through hatred. We don't want to let that happen to ourselves either. We can reject Islam, but we have to be open. And this goes back to what we were discussing earlier in the evening about how do we witness to Muslims? How do we present the gospel to them if we meet them? I don't know if we need to go looking for them. I think that's very, very challenging. But if we meet them in our workplace, in our just out in public, shopping, wherever we go, and we're challenged on our faith, we need to give a witness to our faith. Our very witness of our Christianity will have an impact. And with that, I want to thank you all very much. I hope this was edifying. Whoops, here we go. Hope this was edifying for you. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope it provokes a lot of thought and some further searching and reading. And I hope that we all have a blessed Holy Week and a most radiant Pascha, and that we all come to see Christ and know him through the Holy Spirit, as Saint Silouan the Athonite would say. Any questions, let me know. I'm gonna escape out of full frame view, and thank you very much.
Very good. Thank you very much, Ralph.
Thank you, Ralph.
Get back.
Yeah, John and Ralph, this is Dave Lewis. I
Hi, Dave.
have a couple questions. Ralph, excellent presentation. Thank you. Two questions. One, do the Holy Fathers write at all about the Shroud?
That's a good question, and that really ties into the I think the liturgics of the church, and it's mentioned in the Gospels. I think it may be cryptically mentioned even in some of Paul's writings, but I haven't pursued that. I haven't searched that yet. I don't think it is, unless we look back at these liturgical references to Christ being raised up, us beholding his crucifixion, beholding his resurrection. And there's something really mysterious about all these passages in the divine services that Brian has been culling. He's probably got a couple of dozen. There were so many that I didn't want to like have that be page after page of that. So I picked the most one of the strongest ones. But there's no explicit writing of the Church Fathers. However, there are plenty of contemporary church figures who do venerate the Shroud. So, for instance, even Patriarch Kirill of Moscow, Metropolitan Hilarion Alfeyev, they have made pilgrimages to Turin and venerated the Shroud, given sermons after venerating the Shroud at services there. There are some Orthodox voices who have written about the Shroud. Father Thomas Hopko, I have a link to a podcast he did. Clark Carlton, who has had an Ancient Faith radio podcast, he did a segment on the Shroud. There's a wonderful article by Father Alexei Young, who, of course, was a disciple of Father Seraphim Rose. Very extensive article that goes extensively into the history of the Shroud, the convergences with Orthodox history, iconography. He gets into quite a bit of the history of it that I just did very superficially. So there are some contemporary figures, and those links are provided in that handout. So we can definitely explore those.
one follow-up, Ralph.
Sure.
I wonder if there is a connection between the absence of the writing of the Holy Fathers and the emergence of the Shroud, if I understood the history correctly, in Edessa, about the 5th, 6th century?
Yes. Yeah.
So there may be a correlation with that too.
Well, I think so, and I personally, that's how I kind of understand it. It seems like it almost seems to me that the Shroud wasn't written about openly, this mysteriously referred to as the Archaeopteryton or whatever it's called. The Greek escapes me.
I think it's his internet.
But that specific term, the image not made